Every Thanksgiving, we picture cozy feasts and friendly neighbors. But the real first Thanksgiving rose out of plague, fear, and a wilderness the Pilgrims thought was crawling with the devil. While turkeys roasted over the fire, the Wampanoag watched a dying world and wondered if a new, foreign god had cursed their land.
What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
If you love Terrifying and True, please consider supporting our sponsor, Savorista Coffee. They offer premium blends, but in decaf and half-calf, so you can stay up late, listening to scary stories, watching scary movies, reading scary books, all while still enjoying a bold and delicious cup of coffee. If you head to Savorista.com and use promo code SPOOKY at checkout, you get 25% off your order, and it supports the show directly. That's Savorista.com, promo code SPOOKY. And thank you to all the Spookies that have already checked out Savorista, and Savorista for helping us bring you this program. Each November, we celebrate Thanksgiving with images of pilgrims, turkeys, and a peaceful feast in the New World. But behind that familiar legend lies a much darker one. In 1620, a battered ship called the Mayflower reached the rocky coast of New England. The colonists who stepped ashore expected a promised land. Instead, they found a plague-stricken, empty wilderness. Entire native villages stood abandoned. For the Wampanoag, the forests and swamps of this land were alive with spirits. Hockomock Swamp, the place where spirits dwell, was said to be ruled by Hobbamock, a powerful being of night and death. When a mysterious European disease wiped out most of their neighbors, just before the strangers arrived, some whispered that the newcomers carried death in their breath and in their barrels. While the Pilgrims prayed to a distant god, the Wampanoag watched the sky for omens and listened for the voices of the dead in the marsh. In the tense years that followed, desperate winters, failed crops, and sudden illnesses convinced both peoples that every storm, every comet, and every recovery was a message from beyond. Out of this fear came secret burials, fragile treaties, and a single harvest feast in 1621 that later generations would call the first Thanksgiving. But the truth is far stranger and far more terrifying than the story we tell around the table. Tonight we go beyond the dark realities of the first Thanksgiving and into the mindsets and superstitions of the period. In November of 1620, a small band of English pilgrims stepped off the Mayflower into a world of unsettling unknowns. They found themselves, quote, in winter, in a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men. The dense forests and empty shores of New England were, to these newcomers, as terrifying as they were awe-inspiring. Yet this strange new land was not truly empty. It was the ancestral home of the Wampanoag people, who saw the same landscape very differently, alive with spirits of earth and sky. Over the next decade, the Pilgrims' Puritan beliefs and the Wampanoag spiritual worldview would collide and intertwine, each side haunted by fears of demons, curses, and divine wrath. This is the true story of how supernatural fears and spiritual beliefs shaped the earliest days of colonial New England. It's a tale of wilderness, demons, and guardian spirits, of omens and curses, of a fragile peace overshadowed by an unseen world. From the moment the Pilgrims arrived, the wilderness itself felt menacing. William Bradford wrote that upon landing, they saw nothing welcoming, only endless forest. The wind howled through the pines like a lament. At night, unfamiliar cries echoed among the trees. In December 1620, a small group of settlers camping on the Cape Cod shore awoke to a, quote, hideous and great cry, a sentry shouting, "Arm! Arm!" and men scrambling for muskets. They fired into the darkness, convinced something was out there. By morning, they decided it was probably a pack of wolves, but in that tense midnight moment, their hearts had pounded with dread at unseen terrors just beyond the firelight. New England's forests felt enchanted and eerie to the settlers. Every rustling branch or distant whoop at dusk could be, quote, savages lying in ambush or demons prowling for souls. The English Bible taught that Satan dwelt in wild, untamed places, a, quote, prince of the power of the air, roaming the wilderness. A devout pilgrim alone among the pines might recall how Christ was tempted by the devil in a lonely desert, and wonder if similar demons now tested them in these shadowy woods. The colonists soon took to calling New England a, quote, howling wilderness, not only for the literal wolves and wind, but because it felt as if unholy forces roamed free there. To them, the very land seemed charged with spiritual danger. Yet, for the Wampanoag, by contrast, this same wilderness was sacred and alive with meaning. Far from being empty or evil, the forests, swamps, and hills were filled with spirits and ancestors. The Wampanoag had lived in harmony with this land for millennia, and their cosmology taught that every creature, tree, river, and rock was animated by Manitus, or spirit beings. Some Manitus were gentle guardians, others were tricksters or harbingers of harm. Chief among their feared spirits was Hobomok, sometimes called Cheepy, meaning ghost. Hobomok was the Manitou of death, night, and the unknown. Parents would caution their children with Hobomok tales. For example, he might steal a child's eyes so he would never sleep, or twist a person's legs to cripple them. After European contact, many natives even identified Hobomok with the Christian devil, noting the similarity between a spirit of sudden death and the English descriptions of Satan. One place embodied these native fears, Hockomock Swamp. In the local Algonquin tongue, Hockomock meant place where spirits dwell. For centuries, the Wampanoag ventured into this great bog with reverence. It was a burial ground and a haunt of powerful spirits. They believed Hobomok himself gathered the souls of the dead in the misty bogs. Even today, Hockomock Swamp remains a tangle of silent trees and black water, its reputation still tinged with mystery. The English colonists later nicknamed it Devil's Swamp, having heard the native legends. One can imagine a Wampanoag guide in 1620 leading a pilgrim past the swamp's edge at twilight, whispering that Hobomok lurks within. The pilgrim, clutching his musket tight, might peer into the gloom and feel a prickling on his neck, a shiver at the thought of unseen watchers. In that way, the wilderness itself became a haunted landscape in the minds of both people, though for very different reasons. Both Pilgrims and Wampanoag thus viewed the natural world as spiritually alive, but in opposite ways. To the native people, it was a rich cosmos of spirits, both good and bad, interconnected with daily life. To the Puritans, however, it was a battleground between God and the devil. To the English, the untamed American wilderness felt like ground waiting for God's light, or, as they also feared, a realm that the devil had claimed by default. In either case, every hill and hollow carried an almost biblical weight. Remember that the dark forest pressing in on the Plymouth settlement was never just background scenery. It was an active participant, a testing ground, a refuge for devils, a source of omens, and sometimes a place where one could almost hear the whispers of the unseen. The Pilgrims were Puritan separatists, fervently devout, with every aspect of life saturated by supernatural meaning. They believed the hand of God, or the hand of Satan, was behind every good fortune and every disaster. Nothing was mere chance. As they saw it, they were God's chosen people, a new Israel in a promised land, but also a prime target for the devil's ceaseless scheming. Living in Plymouth's ragtag settlement, half rough cabins and half wilderness, must have felt like being on the front line of a kind of cosmic war, a sudden death, a raging storm, or a bountiful harvest. Each could be a message from on high, or from below. One striking example comes from the Mayflower's voyage. Governor William Bradford tells of a, quote, proud and very profane young man in the crew, a strong seaman who taunted the Pilgrims mercilessly while they were ill and exhausted. He cackled that once they were dead, he'd, quote, make merry with their belongings. But then Bradford recounts with grim satisfaction, divine justice intervened. Quote, it pleased God, before they came half seas over, to smite this young man with a grievous disease, of which he died in a desperate manner. The crew forced his body overboard. The colonists unanimously noted it to be the just hand of God upon him. In other words, they believed God struck down the blasphemer at sea. The scarred Mayflower crew took it as a clear omen. God was watching their small community closely, and he shared favor to the faithful. That story became a sort of founding myth, proof that the Pilgrims' cause was under heavenly protection. Likewise, the Pilgrims believed the devil was very real and present among them. Puritan theology held that the devil prowled like a roaring lion, ever seeking to tempt or torment the godly. In England, they had seen and sometimes participated in witch hunts and trials. They brought those fears to America. Any unexplained calamity might be whispered as the devil's handiwork. Any neighbor behaving oddly or helplessly might be suspected of consorting with darkness. Living in Plymouth, they often felt they were in the literal deserts of Scripture, tested like the Israelites in a desert of temptation. They kept muskets by their beds, not only for fear of native attack, but with a sense that there were spiritual enemies lurking just beyond sight. The Pilgrims distrusted personal visions or dreams, fearing the devil's deceptions. Unlike some more mystical sects, they did not encourage individuals to claim divine revelations. They preferred to rely on Scripture and their ministers. One Puritan put it plainly, quote, "A God who communicated directly with mortals was thought to be the devil in disguise." In other words, if someone started having wild visions, the reasonable Puritan response was alarm, not awe. Omens and portents were taken with utmost seriousness. If a comet blazed in the sky, an earthquake shook the ground, or even strange animal behavior occurred, the colonists immediately searched for spiritual meaning. In 1623, for instance, a desperate drought struck Plymouth. The cornfields wilted. The colonists feared it was God's punishment. They called a solemn fast day, praying and seeking forgiveness. According to Edward Winslow, they prayed together all day, and by evening, a marvel occurred. A soft, gentle rain began to fall. It continued off and on for days, replenishing the drying crops. Crucially, the rain came without thunder or wind. So quiet it seemed miraculous, like the still small voice after Elijah's storm. The Pilgrims were overjoyed. They called it an answered prayer, a gentle blessing that saved the harvest. In fact, the local Wampanoag who witnessed this were astonished, as Bradford noted, by the sudden, gentle rain. The colonists themselves had no doubt this was a miracle. They promptly declared a day of thanksgiving to honor God's apparent mercy. These experiences only reinforced the Pilgrims' conviction that they were actors in a grand divine drama. In their diaries and letters, we see a mix of exultation and dread. Every success, finding an abandoned cache of corn, forging peace with a tribe, recovering from illness, was proof that God's providence smiled on them. Every setback, a sudden death, an ambush, a poor winter, might indicate God's anger or the devil's assault. This bred anxious vigilance. They scanned the natural world for clues of heaven's mood. Bradford later reflected that if not for the Spirit of God and His grace sustaining them, the Pilgrims would have perished in that wilderness. This faith gave the settlers immense strength, the courage to face starvation, scurvy, and cold, but it also cast long shadows of fear because they truly believed the devil was an active enemy. Every strange noise in the night, every sudden calamity took on a terrifying weight. They built palisades and kept watch because they feared not only human enemies, but unseen evil. Their community laws soon reflected just this. By 1630, Plymouth Colony even passed a Witchcraft Act, making it a capital crime to, quote, call upon, conjure with, entertain, or consult evil spirits in order to harm others. In other words, the powwow practices they feared were outlawed among the English. This codified the paranoia of the 1620s into law. This worldview also led the Puritans to view the Wampanoag spirituality as demonic by default. They came from a culture where any non-Christian god was labeled a devil, so when they learned about native beliefs, they assumed the worst. Edward Winslow observed that the Wampanoag acknowledged a good creator, whom the English equated with their god, quote, but another power they worship, whom they call Hobomok. This, as far as we can conceive, is the devil. To the colonists it was obvious. The Indians' false gods were just Satan in disguise. In particular, the Pilgrims were horrified by the powwows and shamans. Winslow describes a powwow's healing ritual in fearsome terms. He would enter a frenzy, quote, calling upon the devil to heal the sick with, quote, many antic and laborious gestures. From the outside, it looked to the English like witches cavorting with demons. In fact, one colonist later summed it up. Puritans viewed Hobomok as the devil, powwows as witches, and their familiars as demons. This deep suspicion would only grow over time, as we will see more so later. For now, the most important takeaway is that to the Pilgrims, native religion was a dangerous darkness, something they believed only their own God could overcome. In the New World, the Puritans carried their faith as a lantern into a vast darkness, a darkness they truly believed was real, filled with Satan's minions and God's ominous messages. As we turn now to the Wampanoag perspective, we see that their understanding of the spirit world was no less rich, and indeed sometimes even more unnerving to the colonists than the devil was to the Puritans. Long before Europeans arrived, the Algonquin-speaking peoples of New England, including the Wampanoag, had a living, oral cosmology. They honored a supreme creator spirit, often called Kitan. Kitan was fundamentally good and distant. He dwelled in the western sky. In Wampanoag teaching, the souls of good people would travel to Kitan after death. The souls of the wicked who traveled west but were turned away from Kitan's door to wander in restless misery. No living person had seen this great spirit, but the elders told the youth to honor and remember him. The Wampanoag held harvest feasts and victory celebrations to thank Kitan, much like the Pilgrims held church services of thanksgiving. To the English, hearing that the natives recognized a great creator sounded somewhat reassuring. They often equated Khitan with the Christian God, but that was where the simplicity ended. Wampanoag cosmology included other powerful beings, chief among them the previously mentioned Hobomok, the spirit of night and death. Winslow wrote that the Wampanoag, quote, worship another power, whom they call Hobomok. To the northward they say Hobomakwai. The reality is nuanced. Hobomok could cause sudden disease or misfortune if angered, yet they also had rituals to appease him in times of crisis. For example, they might make desperate pleas to spare an ailing loved one, and if that person then recovered, it was taken as proof that his influence had turned toward them. We see here a rough parallel to how the Puritans later prayed for salvation during plagues, though the Wampanoag understood it in their own terms. Crucially, Hobomok was believed to physically manifest in various forms. Winslow recorded that he, quote, appears in sundry forms unto them, in the shape of a man, a deer, a fawn, an eagle, etc., but most ordinarily, a snake. The snake form was especially significant to the Wampanoag. In one well-documented healing ritual, a Wampanoag Pawa performing medicine would claim that a spirit snake sat invisibly on his shoulder, licking his patient's wound. The patient could not see the snake, only the Pawa knew it was there. But if the patient then healed, the community took it as evidence that Hobomok himself had been in the tent, actively curing the illness. To a modern reader, this sounds mystical, but to the Puritans, who already equated snakes with Satan, it would have looked downright demonic. An English settler watching a silent Pawa suck a spider bite clean, claiming a snake did it, would have been horrified. To the Wampanoag, it was a sacred victory over sickness. To the Puritans, it would seem like clear evidence of witchcraft. The Pawas held a position of both respect and dread in the Wampanoag society. One account says they, quote, differed from other men because one or several forms of Hobomok entered their bodies as a guardian and familiar. In other words, the Pawa was believed to be possessed by spirit power, giving him abilities that amazed others. The Wampanoag believed that an ill-favored Pawa could curse you, or a benevolent one could heal you, but either way, they wielded powers others did not understand. Even more intriguingly, the Wampanoag said that some of their elite warriors, called Panisi, sought Hobomok's favor from childhood. These Panisi were rigorous. They fasted, ran long laps, and performed vision quests, hoping for a glimpse of the spirit world. Tribal legend has it these warriors gained special strength or invulnerability from Hobomok. One account reported that the Wampanoag believed, quote, no weapon can kill these favored men. It suggests the Wampanoag imagined an aura of divine protection. If a Panisi truly had Hobomok's blessing, he might face battle without fear. The English, upon hearing of the Panisi, assumed this was some form of dark magic or devil's pact, but for the natives it was another face of their spirit-rich world. The brave few communing with the same spirit, Hobomok, but hoping to turn his power into a shield. Beyond the Hobomok and the Pawas, the Wampanoag honored a vast host of lesser spirits. They believed in the spirits of their ancestors and of natural forces. Roger Williams, the Rhode Island founder who knew Algonquin peoples well, noted that neighboring tribes saw divine spirits in 4 directions: in the sun and moon, sea and fire, even a household spirit guarding each home. The Wampanoag left offerings, beads, skins, garlands, at special places. A hunter might leave shells on a hilltop, or a fisherman a bit of tobacco by the river, to thank or appease the local spirit. They also held ceremonies like the Feast of the Dead. Every few years, surviving relatives gathered bones from recent graves, wrapped them in new mats, and held a great feast to honor their ancestors. The Pilgrims, glimpsing these practices, often branded them idolatrous. To the Wampanoag, they were solemn duties that kept the world in balance. Perhaps the most illuminating encounter between the Pilgrims and Wampanoag spirituality came in March of 1623, when Massasoit, the powerful Wampanoag leader, fell deathly ill. Governor Bradford feared losing a crucial ally, so Plymouth sent Edward Winslow to nurse him. Winslow arrived to find the great Sachem's lodge crowded, with Pawas performing a feverish ceremony. Rattles shaking, tobacco smoke spiraling, chants invoking Hobomok's help. Winslow quietly offered Massasoit a simple herbal broth, cleaned his mouth, and urged rest. Remarkably, within days, Massasoit recovered, something the English credited to their god's mercy. Massasoit was immensely grateful. He later said, quote, "The English are my friends and love me. Whilst I live, I will never forget this kindness." After his recovery, he warned Winslow of a plot by another tribe to attack the colonists. In that moment, 2 worlds truly met. The Wampanoag saw that the English might wield a powerful divine ally, and the Pilgrims believed their god had proven stronger than Hobomok. Both cultures interpreted the outcome in their own terms, but one thing was clear: it built a bond. The Wampanoag's spiritual worldview was animistic and complex. Their lives were interwoven with spirits of ancestors and nature. Tragedies and victories alike were explained by the actions of benevolent and malevolent powers. Hobomok embodied their deepest fears of sudden death or misfortune. Yet even he could be engaged, for better or worse, through ritual. Pawas mediated between worlds, commanding both respect and dread. To the colonists, these beliefs were, at best, strange, at worst, diabolical. To the Wampanoag, they were simply the fabric of reality. Every event had meaning. Every sickness had a cause. Every danger had a spiritual countermeasure. From the colonists' perspective, this rich spiritual life was both fascinating and terrifying. They admired that the natives acknowledged a creator, but the moment they heard of Hobomok and the Pawas, their minds turned dark. They concluded that was the devil. That assumption helped to set the stage for deep, mutual misunderstanding. From 1620 to 1630, New England's colonists and natives lived through uncanny events that each side interpreted through their own spiritual lens. It was a period of plagues, meteor sightings, small earthquakes, and eerie coincidences, all filtered through beliefs about God, spirits, and curses. Between 1616 and 1619, just before the Pilgrims arrived, a horrifying epidemic devastated tribes along the coast. A disease likely introduced by European fishermen or traders swept coastal New England. Tens of thousands of native people died. Some villages lost 80 to 90% of their members. One English account described Massachusetts villages empty, fields overgrown, skeletons piled in huts. The Wampanoag were especially hard hit. By 1620, the Patuxet village, where the Pilgrims would land, was wiped out. The few surviving Wampanoag, seeing white strangers move into these abandoned villages, must have been chilling. They coined terms like Watawakananji, stabbers for the newcomers' swords, and words hinting at the newcomers' mysterious power. By 1622, fear on both sides was fanned by rumor. A story spread among tribes that the English had deliberately brought and buried plague in barrels to release against any who opposed them. Squanto, the Patuxet man who had helped the Pilgrims, was one who repeated this rumor. He claimed the English said, quote, "We had plague buried in our storehouse, which, at our pleasure, we could send forth and destroy them therewith." It was a manipulative lie meant to give Squanto leverage in native politics, but it gave grave consequences. When Massasoit's companion, also named Hobbamock, confronted the English with this claim in 1623, one colonist replied that no, the English did not hold plague, but that their God did. In effect, he told the Wampanoag that an even greater power was at work. The Wampanoag concluded that the English deity was fearsome and might use disease as a weapon. Squanto, furious that Winslow had denied his boast, muttered that he would play the English against one another. Beyond epidemic disease, everyday deaths and accidents took on a supernatural hue. In the first terrible winter of 1620 and 1621, roughly half of the original 102 pilgrims died from illness and exposure. The survivors, convinced that only divine providence had kept them, took careful measures with the dead. Bradford recorded that they buried their dead in unmarked graves at night on Coles Hill, above the settlement, so that nearby natives would not see how many had died. Each grave was carefully disguised to appear old. Imagine for a moment lantern-lit midnight funerals in December, a few exhausted men lowering a coffin, hastily throwing earth, tamping it down, forcing grim smiles at one another because it felt safer not to cry. The emotional strain must have been enormous. Later, Bradford noted that despite the mourners sleeping nearby on watch, not one skeleton was disturbed. But for weeks, the colonists lived with that secret grief. The natural world also provided its share of omens. In late 1621, Plymouth experienced a mild earthquake. The colonists recorded the shaking and surely pondered its meaning. In Puritan thought, earth tremors often signaled divine warning. In 1623, that gentle rain after their day of fasting convinced them of God's favor. Other New England stories circulated too. One tale from Massachusetts Bay told of a huge mouse suddenly appearing and biting off a snake's head in the street. They took it as a symbol. The small, faithful colony, the mouse, would overcome the great devil, the snake, in New England. Such stories bolstered their sense of chosenness. On the Wampanoag side, omens and dreams also loomed large, though English records rarely capture them in detail. We know that in 1618, a bright comet blazed in the sky above New England. Europeans linked it to wars and upheaval, and it surely awed the Wampanoag as well. In 1634, just beyond the time period we're discussing, a total solar eclipse reportedly sent chills through both colonists and natives. Tribal elders likely recalled previous droughts, the comet, and strange weather with fear or wonder, offering prayers or warnings. Later stories from King Philip's War in 1675 say Metacom, Massasoit's son, King Philip, claimed a dream visit from his father's spirit, telling him to resist the English, showing how powerful dreams could be in native culture. It's easy to imagine that in the 1620s, around fires at night, elders would treat vivid dreams as true messages from ancestors or Khitan. Cultural misunderstandings added to the ghost stories. Early pilgrims sometimes stumbled on native spiritual sites and took them as ominous. On one scouting trip, colonists found earth mounds with bowls and trinkets, a native gravesite. They opened one of the graves to find a skeleton with yellowish hair, carefully wrapped in birch bark. Fearing curses, they rebundled the body and reburied it. The experience rattled them. Such discoveries and rumors that Indians feared disturbing graves fueled whispers among the colonists. What if disturbing a native burial brought about curses? Ironically, in their first desperate explorations, the Pilgrims themselves had taken corn from native graves at a place later called Corn Hill. They eventually paid the Nauset for that corn, but for a time, those pilgrims must have wondered if stealing food from a tomb would anger a spirit. In a later legend, a squatter on Cape Cod in the 1670s pointed at the same field and claimed a witch's curse would plague any Englishman who ate its corn. Those later tales have roots in these early anxieties. For the Wampanoag, the English themselves were uncanny. Hearing an English musket kill from a distance must have sounded like a demon throwing lightning. One native watcher, seeing Miles Standish fire his gun, exclaimed, quote, "They carry the thunder and lightning with them." Conversely, the colonists marveled at a Pequot or Narragansett archer, invisible in the trees, sending an arrow with deadly accuracy. To them, this too seemed almost magical. Rumors circulated both ways. Some colonists whispered that certain Indians could turn invisible or survive bullets through sorcery, likely inspired by boastful powwows or clever use of cover. Many Wampanoag noticed that while their people suffered plague after plague, none of the English died during the 1620s. Smallpox would come later, in 1633. This disparity was baffling. It lent credence to Squanto's claims and made them suspect that a powerful Manitou protected the settlers. If the English were so protected and the Wampanoag were dying, they reasoned perhaps the English had a stronger god. In all of these stories of plague and portents, a clear pattern emerges. Each people interpreted the same events through their own beliefs. A drought followed by rain was God's mercy to the Pilgrims, but evidence of English prayer power to the Wampanoag. Massasoit's healing showed the English god's strength to native observers. To the colonists, it was another triumph over the devil's tricks. The wilderness itself spoke, but the language differed for each listener. A cloudburst or a child's recovery could inspire thanksgiving on one side, terror and suspicion on the other. This climate of omens and portents took a psychological toll. Both communities carried an extra burden. Not only did they fear tangible threats like hunger or war, but also the idea that those threats might be divine punishment. A bad dream could lead Massasoit to double his village's guards. A sudden illness might send Bradford and his council into days of prayer and repentance. People on both sides were often anxious and introspective. If a pilgrim believed the colony's survival hinged on God's favor, then every sickbed might feel like an accusation of sin. The pilgrims constantly examined their behavior for reasons why God might punish them. Likewise, a Wampanoag family might ask, did someone break a taboo? Did an ancestor's ghost cry out? Is Hubbamock angry with us? In trying to control the uncontrollable, both cultures sometimes looked for scapegoats, deciding that misfortune must be someone's fault. That mutual paranoia, the sense that everything was a sign, would shape both societies to their bones. Despite the relative peace after the 1621 treaty, a current of mutual suspicion steadily grew. Each side began to fear that the other had secret sorcerers working against them. The English had their notions of witches and warlocks. The Wampanoag had powwows and tales of malevolent magic. The contact of 1620 through 1630 was, in part, an encounter between two cryptic, supernatural systems. Misunderstandings sometimes literally looked like magic in the eyes of the others. From the colonists' standpoint, Wampanoag powwows were essentially devil worshippers. Bradford wrote that the powwows were sorcerers who invoke the devil, performing what he called diabolical rites. The Pilgrims thought it was no accident that Satan might appear most active among the heathen. A Puritan writer in 1628 said the devil kept, quote, such as without Christ, under his absolute sway, by their priests and powwows. In practical terms, if they heard drums and chants around a sick person, the colonists assumed a powwow was literally calling evil spirits. Meanwhile, the Wampanoag and other tribes developed their own fears of English sorcery. Squanto's plague rumor that the English could unleash disease at will is the clearest example. Imagine how horrifying that idea sounded, that these strangers could, by will alone, send death on the wind. For people still reeling from an invisible epidemic, it seemed chillingly plausible. Squanto's manipulation nearly sparked a conflict. Massasoit's men were on the verge of killing him for it, until a colonist intervened. Even after the truth was denied, Many natives still looked askance at any white person, wondering what else their god or magic might be capable of. Other sightings added to the mystique. The Wampanoag were fascinated by English gunfire. They marveled that muskets fired from afar could strike without a visible enemy. Conversely, when the Wampanoag used stealth or precision with bows, some colonists muttered that powwows must have enchanted their shots. There were rumors about invisibility, charms, and bewitched ammunition. Even more subtle signs fed the sense of sorcery. Roger Williams recorded that native peoples were astonished that letters could speak across miles. Watching an Englishman read by firelight and then produce actions from what was written must have seemed like the paper itself carried power. A Wampanoag onlooker might have thought written words were magical commands. The English at times leaned into this fear. In 1623, Plymouth learned that the Massachusetts tribe to the north was considering attacking the struggling colony. Warned by Massasoit, Miles Standish led an early morning strike on the village of Wessagusset. Several chiefs were killed in their sleep. To intimidate others, the colonists mounted the head of Wituwamat, one of the slain chiefs, on a pole in Plymouth's palisade. The bloody spectacle was intended as a message that the English meant business. But for the Wampanoag and other tribes, the desecration of a Sachem's body would also have been a spiritual affront. In their belief, the souls of chiefs were potent. Defiling the body risked angering powerful spirits. The colonists aimed to spread fear, but they may have also made themselves seem inhuman. Men who dared to butcher spiritual leaders. Another axis of suspicion was curses on crops or livestock. Both sides believed the other might retaliate by bewitching food supplies. In later decades, stories circulated that when a colonist's cattle died or fields failed, it was due to an Indian curse. Conversely, if a native group had had a bad harvest after a conflict, some whispered that the colonists had cursed their fields. One tale, from slightly later in history, says Pequot powwows laid a curse against the English, and when a late frost in 1634 destroyed some crops, colonists publicly blamed that curse. Such stories show how quickly spiritual explanations would fill in any gap in understanding. In Plymouth's first decade, there were no formal witch trials. The colony's first would not occur until the 1640s, but we can see some sparks. After an early skirmish on Cape Cod in 1621, some pilgrims thought an arrow that narrowly missed a man flew too straight, as if it were charmed. Standish found arrows carved with symbols. He dismissed them as ornamentation, but a few settlers whispered that they might be venefic, magical. No trial followed, but the moment reveals how quick the community was to suspect enchantment. The Wampanoag likely had their own quiet judgments. If they saw an Englishman behaving oddly, perhaps due to grief, drink, or illness, they might decide he was cursed or under evil influence. Later, when Thomas Morton, not a pilgrim himself, but an early English settler who enjoyed native company, was demonized by Puritans as Lord of Misrule, and eventually expelled, some natives may have viewed his removal through a supernatural lens as well, imagining hidden powers behind sudden changes. As time went on, these suspicions would have grim consequences. Even in the 1620s, we see the seeds of paranoia. When disputes or tragedies occurred, each often assumed a magical cause. Yet, in this first decade, open war did not break out between Plymouth and Massasoit's people. Leaders on both sides managed to keep their treaty intact. The Wampanoag warriors and Plymouth militia would even march together against other foes in later years, showing that trust could sometimes outweigh fear, at least for a time. Imagine again a moonlit night in 1628. A Pilgrim mother hurries her children into their log cabin as distant drums beat from a Wampanoag village. The unfamiliar rhythm unnerves her. She instinctively labels it devil music, clutches her Bible, and whispers a prayer as the forest seems to grow colder. Across the wooded hill, a Wampanoag father hears the sharp crack of a musket from Plymouth. He tells his son it is how the pale strangers send warnings, trying to calm him. Inside, he wonders if it was an accident or a sign of anger, recalling Squanto's plague story. Both parents, worlds apart, peer up at the same moon, each wondering what unseen forces are stirring out there in the dark. Thus, the first decade of coexistence was also a decade of shadowy suspicions. It is worth giving thanks to the fact that open conflict never erupted. Leaders like Massasoit and Winslow chose to trust one another above rumors. But distrust never truly vanished. It lingered beneath the surface, like embers under ash. In later years, those embers would indeed be fanned into flame. By 1630, the experiences of those first 10 years had left an enduring mark on both communities. For the Pilgrims and their descendants, one legacy was a dual mentality, practical stoicism married to anxious piety. To survive in the wilderness required courage, hard work, and cooperation with the Wampanoag. To endure what they saw as spiritual trials required ceaseless vigilance. The result was people who seemed industrious and tough, clearing forests, building towns, yet whose hearts constantly asked, "Is God pleased with us? What is He saying through this event?" This inward intensity became a hallmark of New England Puritanism. It fueled a society obsessed with moral righteousness and alert to heresy or witchcraft. Decades later, the witch trials in Salem and elsewhere can be traced back to this mindset, a communal fear pattern forged in the 1620s that whenever misfortunes pile up, which there was no shortage of on the new frontier, the cause must be spiritual rot within. It's telling that during the Salem trials of 1692, some accused witches were said to have seen visions of, quote, Indian devils, or served the devil in animal form, echoes of the early fear of wilderness spirits. Another legacy for the colonists was a paradoxical mix of confidence and paranoia. They felt proven as God's chosen, surviving starvation, disease, and threat, which convinced them a special destiny lay ahead. Bradford described their exodus as if miraculously led by providence, but that very sense of chosenness implied they were the devil's prime target. One early settler compared New England to the woman in Revelation, quote, clothed with the sun, but pursued by the dragon into the wilderness. Towns were fortified with palisades and cannons not just for defense, but with almost religious fervor, as if they were building holy citadels. Strict laws punished any form of conjuration or folk magic. In Plymouth, witchcraft became a capital offense. Native alliances were treated as holy covenants. Massasoit was never attacked as long as he honored the treaty. Yet by the time of King Philip's War in 1675, colonial preachers were calling for extermination of heathens as God's will. The attitudes of holy war and legal fanaticism had roots in this early worldview. For the Wampanoag and other native nations, the legacy was equally profound and tragic. In 1620, the Wampanoag were weakened but independent. By 1630, they had forged a decade of uneasy alliance, only to see wave after wave of new colonists arrive. Spiritually, some began to incorporate the English god into their worldview. Not many formally converted yet, but they spoke of the English deity, often calling him the Great Spirit, or using Manitou broadly. Massasoit hinted at this when he spoke of a friendly God of the English. Since Manitou meant any powerful spirit, some tribes accepted the idea that the colonists' god was a particularly strong Manitou, worth appeasing. This shifting belief may have helped preserve peace. The Wampanoag fed and sheltered the English during that first brutal winter. Some may have felt that aiding the English god's people brought favor from that spirit. Massasoit himself lived into old age, dying around 1661, and no major epidemic struck the Wampanoag for a decade after the Great Plague. Facts that may have seemed like blessings for peace. Yet, underneath that, older spiritual fears never vanished. Many natives surely resented that sacred places like Patuxet and Sawams were now occupied by strangers. They must have wondered if their ancestors' spirits were angered. Some traditional leaders warned that the colonists' god would eventually wipe all of them out. Those voices grew louder in the later 1600s. By King Philip's War, both sides spoke in apocalyptic terms, colonists calling it Satan's uprising, natives calling it the righteous breaking of a colonial spell. The brutal defeat of Metacom and the destruction of the Wampanoag power were foreshadowed by these early relationships of fear and suspicion. Psychologically, the toll on individuals in Plymouth was heavy. By 1630, nearly every original Pilgrim had lost family or close friends. Bradford lost his wife. Others lost children to the first sickness. Processed through a religious lens, these traumas could either shatter faith or harden it. Most pilgrims seem to have doubled down on belief, as it was their lifeline. But the unspoken grief was immense. They discouraged wailing or ornate funerals, seeing such displays as popish. Sorrow seeped out in quieter ways, extra earnest sermons, sleepless nights, whispered prayers. One later story claims that Mary Chilton, a young pilgrim, woke screaming from nightmares of that first winter's horror. Whether literally true or not, it fits the likely reality. Post-traumatic stress haunted many survivors. The Wampanoag, who lived through the 1619 plague, carried deep scars as well. Generations later, their descendants spoke of a mourning wind over empty villages. A 19th century writer on the Agawam tribe remarked that, quote, "feelings of sadness and the whisperings of ghosts come over our souls when we see barren fields where homes once stood." For the Wampanoag, rituals took on new poignancy. Winter sacrifices, dances to accompany the dead, observances at burial mounds, all had so many more ghosts to account for now. One observer noted that the feast of the dead, where bones were reburied, grew more solemn than ever. In a way, both communities, colonists and natives, emerged from the 1620s as haunted peoples, haunted by memories of the dead and of fear of what might yet come. Each tried to cope by redoubling faith. The Pilgrims instituted regular days of thanksgiving and days of humiliation or fasting to stay, as they believed, on God's good side. The Wampanoag intensified offerings to Kiatan and efforts to appease Habamak. Some tribes spared by the earlier plague increased their ceremonies even more, believing it might just be the key to survival. Others grew cold or despairing in their worship. A few younger men began to learn English and serve as interpreters, trying to navigate both worlds at once. Amid this grim legacy, there were also bonds forged in hardship. The friendship between Plymouth and Massasoit endured until the great Sachem's death. Winslow and Massasoit remained special friends. Winslow even took a native name, Wensau. The personal trust established when each cared for the other showed that empathy could cross worlds. Imagine Winslow by Massasoit's side in 1623, spooning broth into the Sachem's mouth while the chief's anxious family watched. In that moment, worries about witchcraft and curses receded. All that mattered was saving a human life. Massasoit was forever grateful for that kindness shown. Such scenes created a counter-narrative of hope that two peoples, however different, could understand and care for one another. That hope flickered in Plymouth for some time. The first generation of Pilgrims and Wampanoag coexisted in relative peace, with scares and tension but no outright war between them. They even shared in mutual celebrations. The most famous, of course, is the autumn 1621 harvest feast, later romanticized as the first Thanksgiving. Whatever anxieties existed were set aside for those days of feasting and sport. Winslow describes Massasoit bringing about 90 men for 3 days of games and eating. They held shooting contests and gambled with arrows and knives. It's easy to imagine deer and turkey roasting over open fires, English and Wampanoag children chasing each other between makeshift tables. In the bright daylight of friendship, the terrors of the previous winter, the howling wolves, the hideous cries in the dark, must have felt far away. Winslow reported that the English and Indians gave thanks together for the bounty. the Pilgrims to the Christian god, the Wampanoag to Kiatin. It was a high note of cross-cultural goodwill. It could not last forever, as history shows, but it was real while it lasted. It stands as a testament that even amid early terrors, people still found reasons to unite in gratitude. In reflecting on 1620 through 1630 in New England, the so-called era of Thanksgiving, we find that history here is terrifying and true. Not because literal ghosts lurked behind every tree, but because fear and faith shaped how people saw the world and what they did to one another. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag each gazed into the unknown wilderness and found different monsters staring back. The devil of Puritan sermons, the spirits and manitous of Wampanoag lore. Their story reminds us how much of history is guided not just by politics and economics, but by the hopes and fears of the human heart. Today, you can visit Plymouth, Massachusetts, and see Burial Hill, the rustling forests, and a reconstructed Wampanoag village by the river. Stand on the shore where the Mayflower landed, or in the hush of the woods, and you may sense the weight of those years. In the silence, you might imagine anxious souls still moving through the trees. A pilgrim father trudging home with his musket at dawn, whispering a psalm against the darkness. A Wampanoag mother burning sweetgrass at twilight to protect her children from ill spirits. Their fears and their faith, their nightmares and their dreams became part of the American experience. Today, the wilderness has been tamed for many years, but the tales of those early terrors show how thin the line between myth and reality was for our forebears. In their minds, devils cried in the wind and guardian spirits glimmered in moonlit swamps. Yet, in facing those fears, they pressed on, together, sowing the first seeds of a new civilization, for better or for worse. Even in the darkest wilderness, they searched for meaning, clung to belief, and tried, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, to understand one another. And if you listen on a cold November night, you might still hear echoes of their prayers and their fears carried on the wind through the haunted woods of New England. So, my spookies, as Turkey Day approaches, take a moment to be thankful and give a little thought to the harsh realities that eventually led to a civilization unlike any ever seen before.
Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. It's executive produced by Rob Fields and Bobbletopia.com, and produced by Dan Wilder, with original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you think we should cover on Terrifying and True, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us for as little as $1 a month, go to weeklyspooky.com/join. Your support for as little as $1 a month keeps the show going. And speaking of, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their name at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Kate and Lulu, Jessica Fuller, Mike Eschewey, Jenny Green, Amber Hansberg, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and thank you for listening. We'll see you all right here next time on Terrifying and True.